He rode into her family's yard just before sunset, and by the time Addie Foster reached Stratton Land the next morning, she had already decided how the conversation would go. She was wrong about that, same as she was about nearly everything else that day. The gate to Stratton Ranch stood open, its iron hinge groaning in wind that smelled of dry grass and coming trouble. Addie reined in her horse at the top of the rise and looked down at the house, sturdier than she'd imagined, with a porch that wrapped clean around the front and smoke curling steady from the chimney, as if the man inside had no notion his world was about to change. She had come to end a wedding that had never been hers to begin with. Her sister Margaret was 3 days gone, last seen boarding a stage bound east with a drummer from Denver who sold patent medicine and made promises Addie doubted he intended to keep. She had left a letter, an apology, and a debt no one but Addie seemed willing to pay. Someone had to ride out and tell Caleb Stratton that the woman he was set to marry inside the week would not be coming. Addie had volunteered before her father could ask her twice. She dismounted near the barn boots, landing hard in the dust, and a tall man came around the corner with a coil of rope over one shoulder and sawdust on his forearms. He stopped when he saw her. Something in his face eased like a held breath let go. "You made good time," he said. "I wasn't expecting you until the mail wagon came through." Addie opened her mouth to correct him and could not quite find the words fast enough. "Mr. Stratton," she began instead, "I need to speak with you about my sister." The ease in his face didn't vanish so much as fold itself away. He set the rope down slow, the way a man sets down a rifle he isn't ready to put to use. "Your sister?" "Margaret Foster. I'm Adeline. Addie." She made herself hold his eyes. "She isn't coming, Mr. Stratton. She left 3 days ago. I rode out because somebody needed to tell you plain, and I didn't think it should come by letter." For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through the porch rails and a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind the barn. Addie had pictured this scene a dozen ways on the ride over. Anger seemed the likeliest, a man jilted before the ceremony even had a date fixed to it, a marriage arranged between two feuding ranches to end a fight over water that had already cost both families more than either could afford. She had steeled herself for shouting, or worse, for the kind of cold, quiet fury that men like her father turned on anyone who cost him money. Caleb Stratton did neither. He exhaled long and slow, and something that might almost have been a smile pulled at one corner of his mouth. Tired, not cruel. "Well," he said, "that explains why the man from the bank looked so pleased with himself this morning." "You're not—" Addie stopped. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not surprised your sister ran. I only wish she'd run a week earlier before Elias Cross rode out here smiling like a man who already owns the deed to my father's grave." He looked past her toward the creek that cut silver through the far pasture, the water that both their families had bled over for 2 years running. "Come inside, Miss Foster. There's more to this than a wedding, and you rode a long way to hear only half of it." She followed him up the porch steps against every instinct that told her to turn her horse around and ride straight home. Inside the house was plainer than she expected, a widower's house, though Caleb Stratton had never married, a house kept by a man too busy fighting for his land to trouble much over curtains. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether she wanted any, and set one across the table from her along with a folded paper gone soft at the creases from handling. "My father and yours signed this 18 months before he died," Caleb said. "A water agreement. Stratton Land holds the headwaters of Antelope Creek. Foster Land needs what runs down from it to keep cattle alive past July. Our fathers hated each other plenty, but they weren't fool enough to let hatred kill 2 herds when a marriage could settle the water rights, permanent, folded into one deed, one family." Addie set her cup down carefully. "And if there's no marriage, then the agreement lapses at the end of this month, same as it says right there in my father's hand. And Elias Cross at the bank happens to hold notes on both our ranches heavy enough to foreclose the moment that water dispute reopens." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's been waiting on it. I bet my saddle he's the reason your sister found herself a drummer with money to spend on running shoes." That stopped her breath for half a second. You think he paid her to run? I think a man who wants 2 ranches doesn't need to burn a barn when he can just wait for 2 stubborn families to ruin themselves over pride. Caleb rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for the first time Addie saw the exhaustion underneath the calm a man who had buried his father and inherited a war in the same season. I don't fault your sister for wanting a different life than the one that letter promised her. I fault myself some for thinking a piece of paper could fix what 2 dead men started. Addie sat with that a moment, turning her coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table. Outside, a hand called something to another across the yard. Ordinary words about fence line and feed, the kind of sound that made the trouble inside the house feel smaller and larger all at once. What happens to my family's cattle if the water agreement lapses? She asked finally. Same as happens to mine. Cross forecloses on whichever ranch can't make its note, then buys the other cheap once it's got no water rights left to bargain with. He's been circling both our places 2 years now. All he needed was a reason. Caleb met her eyes. Your sister running gave him one. Addie thought of her father, the deep lines that had carved themselves into his face this last year. The way he'd stopped mentioning the bank at supper because saying the word out loud seemed to make the debt more real. She thought of 40 head of cattle that would not survive an August without creek water, and a sister 3 days gone, with no plan to come back and fix what she'd broken. I can't marry you in her place, she said, if that's what you're about to ask. I wasn't going to ask that. Caleb almost smiled again, though there was no humor left in it. I was going to ask if you'd stay a week. Long enough to help me find a way to hold Cross off the deed without a wedding license standing between us and him. Long enough for me to figure out whether there's a version of that agreement your father and mine wrote that doesn't require either of us marrying a stranger to keep it standing. You want my help. I want somebody in this who isn't already halfway to bankrupt or halfway to bought, Caleb said. From what I hear, that's you. Addie studied him across the table, the steadiness in him, the way he hadn't once raised his voice or blamed her for a decision that wasn't hers, the careful control of a man who'd learned the hard way that anger didn't win back land once a banker's signature was on it. She thought about riding home and telling her father there was nothing to be done. She thought about the look that would put on his face. 1 week, she said. Then I ride home, married or not, and we find another way. 1 week, Caleb agreed, and something in his voice made it sound less like a bargain and more like a door easing open on a room neither of them had planned to walk into. Neither of them noticed that first evening, the folded page Caleb had tucked back inside his coat pocket, the one with a second signature at the bottom of his father's water agreement. A name that wasn't Foster or Stratton, written in ink gone brown with age, waiting for someone to ask why it was there at all. If a story like this one, about 2 families forced together by a fight neither of them chose and a debt that only trust could pay off, is the kind that keeps you watching until the very end, stay close, because the water war at Antelope Creek was only the first trouble Addie Foster would find waiting on Stratton land. What would you have done in her place? Ridden home the moment the truth was told? Or stayed to fight for 2 families who had never once been kind to each other? Tell us in the comments. Morning came early on Stratton land, and Addie was already awake when Caleb knocked on the door of the small room off the kitchen where he'd set her up the night before. Cross rides through most Thursdays to check on the fence he claims Foster cattle keep breaking, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. I'd rather he see us handling business than see us standing around waiting on him. Then give me something to handle, Addie said, and pulled her boots on before he'd finished his coffee. He led her out to the north pasture, where a dozen head of Stratton cattle stood bunched and uneasy near a stretch of downed fence, one cow down on her side in the grass, breathing too fast, her leg tangled bad in wire. Foreman's out chasing strays past the ridge, Caleb said. Was hoping to get to her before noon. Addie was already moving. She'd grown up doctoring her father's herd with her own 2 hands, since Foster Ranch never had money enough to keep a full crew, and there was no fear in her when she knelt beside the animal and began working the wire loose with steady fingers, murmuring low the whole time, in a voice meant to calm rather than soothe herself. "Hold her head," she told Caleb, and he did, without a single question about whether she knew what she was doing. It took the better part of an hour, but the cow stood again by the time they finished favoring the leg, but sound enough to walk. Caleb studied Addie across the animal's back, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Your sister ever do work like that?" he asked. "Margaret hates the smell of a barn." Addie wiped her hands on her skirt, not caring how it looked. "I never did understand how two sisters could come out so different." "I'm starting to understand it fine," Caleb said, and there was warmth enough in it that Addie looked away first. They were still coiling the wire when a rider came up the fence line at an easy pace that didn't match the tightness suddenly in Caleb's shoulders. Elias Cross sat his horse like a man who'd never done an honest day's labor in his life, hat tipped back, smile already fixed in place before he was close enough to need it. "Stratton." Cross's eyes slid to Addie and stayed there a beat too long. "And here I heard tell your bride ran off with a peddler. Word travels fast for a man who spends most of his day behind a desk," Caleb said evenly. "Word travels fast when a man's got an interest in how it turns out." Cross's gaze hadn't left Addie. "You'll forgive me, miss, if I don't recall a foster daughter with hands that rough." Something in the way he said it, like an accusation dressed up as a compliment, made Addie's spine go straight. "I'm Adeline Foster. My sister isn't coming, Mr. Cross. And I don't imagine that surprises you half as much as you're pretending." Cross's smile thinned by a fraction. "I don't know what you mean by that." "I think you do," Caleb said, stepping half a pace forward, close enough that Cross's horse shifted back on its own. "And I think you ought to remember whose fence you're standing on before you say another word to Miss Foster you can't take back." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Cross laughed, short and easy, the kind of laugh a man uses to paper over a retreat. "No offense meant. Only came to remind you the note's due end of month water agreement, or none. Bank doesn't much care whose bride shows up." He touched his hat toward Addie in a way that felt more like a warning than courtesy, and turned his horse back toward the road. Neither of them spoke until he was well out of earshot. "He knows," Addie said. "About Margaret. He knew before I told him." "I've thought the same since your sister's letter came." Caleb's jaw was tight. A drummer with money enough to sweep a rancher's daughter off her feet inside a week doesn't happen by accident, not in a county this small. I'd wager Cross paid that man's fare east and never once had to say why. Then he wanted the agreement broken. He's wanted it broken since the day he learned there was an agreement at all. Caleb looked toward the creek, silver and unbothered in the morning light, indifferent to everything it had caused. "Come on. There's a ledger in the house I want you to see. If we're going to beat him, I need somebody looking at these numbers who isn't already half convinced we're beaten." That evening, after the numbers had been turned over twice and made no more sense than they had the first time, Caleb poured 2 glasses of something that wasn't quite whiskey and wasn't quite anything else, and they sat out on the porch while the sky went the color of a bruise healing. "Your father ever tell you how the feud started?" Addie asked. "Real reason, not the version everybody in town repeats." "My father said your grandfather dammed the creek first back before either of us was born, and mine tore it out with his bare hands rather than watch his cattle die of thirst. Your father tells it the other way around, I'd guess." "Word for word," Addie admitted, and something in the shared absurdity of it pulled a laugh out of her before she could stop it. Surprised and real. The first one she'd let herself have since Margaret's letter arrived. Caleb watched her like a man who hadn't expected that sound and wasn't sure what to do with how much he liked it. "2 old men," he said, "too stubborn to remember which one of them started it, both dead now, and still costing their children the water. Maybe that's why the marriage was supposed to fix it. One family instead of 2, arguing over who dug what first." Caleb turned his glass slow in his hand. "I used to think that was a fine enough reason to marry a woman I'd never met. Lately, I've started to wonder if my father had some other reason for wanting the Foster and Stratton names joined that had nothing to do with a creek at all. What makes you say that? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out the folded water agreement from the day before, smoothing it flat across his knee, and pointed to a line at the bottom Addie hadn't noticed the first time. A second signature beneath his father's faded near past, reading the ink gone the color of old rust. "That's not your father's hand," Caleb said. "And it isn't mine. I've been staring at it 2 days trying to place it, and I can't." Addie leaned closer, and something about the shape of those letters tugged at a memory she couldn't quite reach. A name she'd heard once, long ago, in a voice she associated with her own childhood kitchen and couldn't place further than that. "I don't know it either," she said slowly, "but I feel like I should." From the barn, a lantern moved. Old Amos Pruitt, making his last round of the horses before turning in. Stratton's longtime hand, older than the ranch house itself, who'd worked the land since before either Caleb or Addie had been born. He passed close enough to the porch to catch sight of them there, and something in his weathered face shifted when his eyes landed on Addie. Not confusion, but recognition, quick and startled, gone again almost before it showed. "Evening, Miss Foster," he said too carefully, and kept walking toward the barn without waiting for her to answer, though his steps had gone just a little faster than they needed to be. Addie watched him go, a small, cold unease settling under her ribs that had nothing to do with Elias Cross or the bank or the water rights lapsing in 3 weeks' time. "He said my name," she said quietly, "like he already knew it before I told anyone here who I was." Caleb was watching the same retreating lantern light, his expression gone thoughtful, in a way that made Addie certain he'd noticed it too. "Amos has been on this ranch longer than my father owned it," he said. "If there's a name on the bottom of that agreement nobody living can place, he might be the only man left who remembers who put it there." Neither of them moved to follow him that night, but the question sat between them on the porch long after the lantern had disappeared into the barn, old enough. Addie was beginning to understand that it had started long before her sister ever climbed onto that eastbound stage, and had been waiting, patient as the creek itself, for someone to finally ask. The truth came from Amos Pruitt 3 days later, and it came slow, the way old men tell things they've carried a long time and are tired of carrying alone. He found Addie at the well before dawn, working the pump with more force than the task required, the way she'd taken to doing lately, whenever her thoughts outran her hands. Amos watched her a moment before he spoke. "That name on the agreement," he said, "the one you and Mr. Stratton been puzzling over. It's Thomas Whitfield." Addie's hands went still on the pump handle. "I don't know that name." "No reason you would. He surveyed this whole valley back before either ranch had a fence to its name. Laid the lines for both Stratton and Foster land, back when they were 1 grant, not 2. Amos's voice had gone careful, the tone of a man walking ground he wasn't sure would hold. "He had daughter, married her off young to a man passing through, moved east, and nobody in this valley spoke her name again after that, far as I ever heard. But I remember her face, Miss Foster. Saw it again the first evening you rode in." "You're saying you look like your grandmother," Amos said, "and I'm saying Thomas Whitfield never split that grant clean between the 2 families he surveyed. There's a clause in the original paperwork, the real one, not the copy Mr. Stratton's been reading, that says the water rights on Antelope Creek stay shared between Whitfield's descendants, regardless of what happens between Stratton and Foster. No marriage needed. No agreement to lapse. It was already settled 60 years back in ink nobody living was supposed to remember existed." Addie felt something shift under her ground she'd thought solid, turning suddenly to water. If that's true, then Cross can't foreclose over the water rights at all. "That's why I expect he spent 2 years making sure nobody found the original," Amos said. "Man like Cross doesn't fear an old feud. He fears an old deed." She went to find Caleb with the truth still raw in her mouth, and found instead Elias Cross's buggy already pulled up outside the ranch house, and Caleb standing on the porch with a letter in his hand, and an expression on his face she hadn't seen since the morning she'd told him her sister wasn't coming. "You want to explain this?" he asked before she'd even reached the steps, and held the page out toward her. It was her father's handwriting. Or close enough to fool anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime reading grocery lists and cattle counts in that same careful, uneven script. The letter offered Cross a private arrangement Foster water rights, signed over quiet debt forgiven, in exchange for Cross letting the Stratton foreclosure go through unopposed. "This isn't my father's letter," Addie said, and heard how thin it sounded, even to her own ears. "Cross brought it himself. Said he thought I ought to know what kind of bargain your family was making behind my back, while you sat at my table eating my food and asking after my dead father's business." Caleb's voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Said you rode out here to stall me, to keep me trusting long enough for your father to sell out from under both of us." "And you believed him." "I don't know what I believe." Something raw moved behind his eyes, old wounds reopening faster than new evidence could close them. "I know I trusted you with the one thing that could save this ranch, and now there's a letter in your father's hand saying he'd rather sell me out than lose a few head of cattle." "My father can't write half that fine a hand when his knuckles are aching, which is most mornings past October," Addie said, anger rising now to match the hurt. "And he would sooner lose every cow he owns than shake Elias Cross's hand on anything. You know that man. You've watched him work this valley 2 years. Why is his word worth more to you than mine?" Caleb had no answer for that, not one he could say out loud, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Cross, still waiting by his buggy with the particular patience of a man who has already won, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "I'll leave you two to sort your business," he said. "Though I'd remind you, Stratton, the note comes due in 11 days, regardless of who's been lying to whom." He drove off unhurried, and Addie stood on the porch with her hands shaking, not from cold. "I found the truth this morning," she said finally, "about the second name on that agreement. About why Cross wants it lost so badly he'd forge my father's hand to bury it." She told him everything Amos had said, the surveyor, the daughter, the grant that predated both their families' fences, and made the whole foreclosure threat hollow as a dry well. Caleb listened, and something in his face wanted to believe her. She could see it fighting the doubt Cross's letter had planted, like a man trying to trust a bridge he'd just watched someone try to burn. "If that's true," he said slowly, "why didn't Amos say something 2 years ago when the bank first started circling? Maybe he didn't know it mattered until Cross showed up with a forged letter trying to bury it for good." Addie held his gaze, refusing to look away first this time. "I didn't come here to trick you, Caleb. I came because my sister broke a promise and somebody in my family had to make it right. I'm still trying to make it right. Even now, with you standing there looking at me like I'm one of his lies." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb folded the forged letter once, careful, and set it down on the porch rail like something he no longer trusted himself to hold. "I need to think," he said. "Alone, if you don't mind." It wasn't the accusation she'd feared. It was worse in its way, the quiet retreat of a man who didn't know yet how to trust his own judgment again. Addie went back to her room and packed what little she'd brought, hands moving on their own while her mind stayed fixed on the unfairness of being doubted after everything she'd risked to help a man who wasn't even truly hers to help. She left before first light the next morning, telling herself it was easier this way. Easier to ride home and let her father find some other path through the ruin Margaret had started. Easier than staying somewhere she wasn't fully believed. She was 3 miles down the road when Amos caught up to her on his old gray gelding, moving faster than she'd thought the animal had left in him. "You'll want to turn around," he said, breathless. "Found something in my trunk last night going through my late wife's things. She kept Thomas Whitfield's daughter's letters years back before she passed. There's a pocket watch in there, too, engraved T.W., matches the initials on that old grant paper, close enough that no court in the territory could call it coincidence." He held out a small leather pouch, worn soft with age. "This proves your claim, Miss Foster. proves the marriage never needed to happen at all, and proves your grandmother's blood runs through this creek same as any Stratton's. Addie took the pouch with hands that weren't quite steady. Does Caleb know? Rode out to find you myself before I told him anything. Figured you'd want to be the one to bring it back. Amos's weathered face was grim now, all urgency. But there's worse news riding behind me. Cross filed papers with the county clerk first thing this morning, invoking an old default clause neither Stratton nor Foster knew was buried in that agreement. He isn't waiting 11 days anymore, Miss Foster. He's moved the foreclosure auction up to Saturday, next 5 days from now. Says if there's fraud involved on either side, best to settle land ownership quick before lawyers start arguing grants nobody's proven yet. 5 days. Addie looked back down the road toward Stratton Ranch, toward a man who might still believe a lie about her, and toward a fight that had just stopped being about trust and become once again about whether either family would have land left to stand on by the end of the week. Then I'm not going home, she said, and turned her horse back the way she'd come. Not until Saturday's settled, one way or another. Caleb was in the barn when she rode back in, currying a horse he didn't need to curry, the kind of work a man finds for his hands when his mind won't settle. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway, and whatever he'd meant to say died somewhere between his chest and his mouth. Amos told you, Addie said before he could speak first, about the watch, the letters. My grandmother. She held out the leather pouch, steady now, though her heart wasn't. I'm not here because I need you to believe me anymore, Caleb. I'm here because Cross moved the auction to Saturday, and whatever's left unsettled between us, this ranch doesn't have time for it. Caleb set the curry comb down slow and crossed the barn to take the pouch from her hands. He opened it, careful the way a man opens something he's half afraid will disappear if he moves too fast, and turned the pocket watch over once in his palm. TW etched small and worn soft by 60 years of some stranger's thumb. I should have trusted you the moment Cross walked off that porch smiling, he said. I've spent 2 years watching that man lie so smooth it never once looked like lying, and the one time it mattered most, I let him do it to me again. You were afraid? Addie said. Not of me. Of losing everything your father left you. Same as I've been afraid of losing everything mine's still fighting to keep. I understand it. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. Then let me earn it back, Caleb said. Starting now. Starting with beating that man Saturday together the way we should have been doing all along. They rode into the county seat together 3 days later. The pouch and its papers, along with a lawyer, Amos vouched for personally, all packed careful into Caleb's saddlebag. The courthouse steps were already crowded by the time they arrived. Half the valley had turned out to watch, word having spread the way word does in small towns, that the Stratton-Foster water feud was finally coming to a head in public, one way or another. Elias Cross stood near the auctioneer's block in a fresh coat, looking every bit a man who expected to walk away that afternoon owning 2 ranches instead of none. His smile faltered only slightly when he saw Addie and Caleb arrive together, unhurried, without the desperation he'd clearly been counting on. Come to watch your land change hands, have you? Cross said, pitched loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Admirable, showing up for the ceremony. Came to stop it, Caleb said just as loud, and nodded to the lawyer beside him. What followed took the better part of an hour, and Addie stood through every minute of it at Caleb's side, rather than behind him, answering the county clerk's questions about her grandmother, directly laying out Amos's testimony about the surveyor's daughter, presenting the original grant with its buried clause in her own steady voice, while the crowd murmured and Cross's composure cracked wider with every sentence. This changes nothing about the notes both ranches owe the bank, Cross said when the clerk finally called for quiet, his voice gone thin and quick in a way it hadn't been before. Water rights or not, foreclosure stands on the debt alone. Foreclosure stands on a default clause you slipped into an agreement neither family's lawyer ever reviewed, Addie's lawyer said, stepping forward with a second folder Amos had helped assemble the night before. Records of Cross's private dealings with the drummer who'd carried Margaret east, a paper trail of payments that traced back, however carefully disguised, to Cross's own bank ledger. A clause we can now show was drafted specifically to trigger once you'd arranged for the marriage meant to prevent it to fail. That's not foreclosure, Mr. Cross. In this territory, that's fraud. The crowd's murmur turned sharper, closer to a growl, as neighbors who'd spent 2 years watching Cross circle both ranches began putting pieces together out loud faster than Cross could talk over them. The county judge called in from his morning docket to settle what had become the valley's most talked-about auction in a decade. Did not take long to rule the foreclosure void, pending a full inquiry into Cross's conduct. An inquiry that would, within the month, see him stripped of his position at the bank and facing charges serious enough that he left the territory before the first hearing. If stories like this one, about 2 families pulled together by trouble neither of them chose to, and a truth patient enough to wait 60 years to be told, are the kind that stay with you, subscribe and ride along for the next journey across the frontier. Because there's always another wrong arrival waiting to become the right one. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, with the crowd thinning and her father pushing through to catch her in a hug, rough with relief, Addie caught Caleb watching her from a few feet off, the pocket watch still turning slow between his fingers. "Your grandmother's watch," he said, once her father had stepped away to shake hands with half the valley. "Feels wrong me holding on to something that was always yours." "Feels right to me," Addie said, "considering how it found its way back." He crossed the last few feet between them, and there was nothing careful left in the way he looked at her now. No doubt, no hesitation, dressed up as caution. "I owe you a wedding that never should have been forced on either of us in the first place," he said. "I'm not offering you that one. I'm asking plain whether you'd consider a different one. No agreement behind it. No bank forcing our hand. Just you and me in a valley that's finally got water enough for both our names." Addie looked past him toward the mountains where Antelope Creek began the water that had caused 2 years of grief, and now somehow felt like the thing that had brought her exactly where she was supposed to be standing. "Ask me again," she said, "once the herds are through calving, and neither of us has a bank breathing down our necks. I want to say yes, because it's true, not because it's convenient." "Fair enough," Caleb said, smiling, now the tired, careful weight gone out of it at last. "I've got time. Seems I've finally got a ranch worth keeping it on." Spring came generous that year, the creek running high and clean between Stratton and Foster land alike. Cattle from both herds grazing close enough along the water's edge that no one much bothered anymore keeping strict count of whose was whose. Amos Pruitt kept his post by the barn, telling anyone who'd listen the story of the surveyor's daughter and the pocket watch that had settled a 60-year-old debt, embellishing it a little more with each telling, the way old men do with stories they're proud to have lived long enough to finish. Caleb asked Addie again that October, under a sky gone gold with the last of the harvest light, and this time there was no bank, no forged letter, no shadow of Elias Cross standing between the question and her answer. She said yes, standing in the same north pasture where she'd first knelt to free a tangled cow from barbed wire hands rough and unhidden. Exactly the way he'd first come to know her. Sometimes, the wrong arrival really does lead us to the life that was waiting all along. Do you believe some mistakes are second chances wearing a stranger's face? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories from the frontier, where every weathered gate may yet open onto a home nobody saw coming.